Hamilton College and Zogby International Polling yesterday released their new national poll of Muslim American attitudes toward the U.S. war on terrorism and related international issues. The researchers discussed their findings at the National Press Club for about 45 minutes.
Is there any cameras in the box?
Good morning. I'm Dennis Gilbert, Professor of Sociology at Hamilton College. We are here this morning at the National Press Club to look at the results of the Hamilton Muslim America poll, a national survey of Muslims in the United States. Before we start, I want to introduce the other people who will be speaking with me today. 9 Hamilton College students participated in conducting this survey, and we have 2 of them here today. Leann Atkinson on my right graduated from Hamilton on Sunday. She's from Cassville, New York. She'd like to find a job in Washington if anybody out there has one. On my left, Paul Jones from Skaneateles, New York. He will be starting his senior year at Hamilton next fall. And also with us, Shahzada Ahmad, who is a law student. She graduated from Hamilton last year, and she was one of the people who gave us some advice about our questionnaire. She is from a Pakistani American family. She grew up in a very exotic place, Long Island, New York. I asked Shahzada to come today and give us a personal Muslim perspective on the poll. Also here this morning, I do want to thank her, is Maya Hamid, who is graduated also on Sunday from Hamilton, and is Pakistani, gave us some help with the poll, may be willing to answer questions later on if people have any for her. I'm going to give a quick overview of the poll. After that, Leann, Paul, and Shaz will speak from a more personal point of view about the results. All of that we're hoping to do in about 30 minutes if we're successful, and leave some time for questions. We did this poll in late April. We worked with Zogby International to contact, that's a major national polling firm, to contact 521 Muslims across the country, a representative sample of Muslims in the United States. Most of the people we talked to are foreign-born, but about 90% of them are American citizens. A very impressive portrait of American Muslims emerged from our interviews. In some way, the people that we talked to are an advertiser's demographic dream. They are, on average, quite young, quite prosperous, highly educated, about twice as likely to have a college degree as the average American adult, very family-oriented. We found that they are 50% more likely to be married than the average American adult, generally religiously observant, and, this should be good news for Tom Daschle, inclined toward the Democratic Party. They are also a very culturally diverse group. About 1/3 of the people we talked to were born in an Arabic country, Arabic-speaking country. About 1/6 were born in Pakistan. Many were African Americans, some Africans also in the poll. About 6% were white, native-born Americans. The survey included a series of questions about the war on terrorism and related foreign policy matters. Probably the single most provocative item in the poll was a question about responsibility for the September 11th attacks. And that question, which by the way is, if you have the report, I think it's on page 12 in the report. Basically, that question runs something like this. Some people say that Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, orchestrated the attacks. Other people say some other group was responsible. Who do you think was responsible? Only 1/3 of the people we talked to said they thought that Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda were responsible for the attacks. How can we explain this remarkable outcome of the poll, that only 1/3 of the American Muslims we talked to subscribe to a notion that is almost universal, I think, in this country? In part, it may be a matter of the phrasing of the question. We put the question in a way that almost required people to think about other groups. But obviously, there's something else involved. I think it is understandable that it is very difficult for any Muslim to accept the notion that Muslims were responsible for this terrible act. Many of the people we talked to told us that Islam abhors the killing of innocents. And they were very insistent about that, sometimes very emotional about that. And here we have a case in which many innocents were slaughtered by people in the name of Islam. I think it's obvious that this would be very difficult for American Muslims to accept. I think it's also not hard to put yourself in the place of the American Muslims we talked to and imagine how admitting Muslim responsibility for this feels. If you accept the notion that Muslims did this terrible deed, you are yourself somehow implicated in it. At least that's the way it feels. One man told us, "I'm not a terrorist," as if that was something that he had to prove to us. You more or less give a license to every street corner bigot to harass you and your children if you admit that this is something that Muslims did. And you give the Department of Justice a license to suspend the civil rights of Muslims. And I think that is the way it feels to a lot of Muslims. 2/3 of the people that we spoke to, the questions that you'll find in the report, 2/3 of the Muslims we spoke to felt that their civil rights were being infringed in a way that was unwarranted by the recent questionings and arrests of Muslims. I'd offer one final observation about this. As a researcher, what struck me most about the response to this question, and again, you'll find that in the report, was not the small number of people who said al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden are responsible, but the larger number, 44%, who couldn't or wouldn't answer the question. And I think that says much about how painful this is for them. It's a remarkable thing. It's very, very rare. In fact, I can't think of another case of finding so many people in the don't know column.
What was that number again?
In the report, it was 44% who said either wouldn't answer the question or couldn't answer the question. The don't knows. Despite their reluctance to pinpoint.
You have that broken out?
Yes.
Between the ones who refused to answer and the ones who had no opinion?
No, and one reason for that is that it's hard to do. That is, I think quite often people refuse. People say they have no opinion when they're really just refusing. I think it's a false distinction. Despite this reluctance to blame al-Qaeda for the events of September 11th, the majority of Muslim Americans think that the U.S. military response in Afghanistan is justified. So I think that may also say something about who they think is responsible. So the majority are saying the military response was justified. Another foreign policy issue that we asked about was Iraq. And Muslims were somewhat divided on this, but there was one result that I thought was surprising and I think might make the White House happy. Almost half of the people we talked to agreed that it would be a good thing if the U.S. would try to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Found that a surprising result. The one area in which American Muslims are at odds with the American mainstream is clearly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Overwhelmingly, they told us that the U.S. consistently sides with the Palestinians sides with the Israelis against the Palestinians, and that's not something that they think that Bush is going to correct. They don't have any faith in him in that regard. The other major area that we looked at was discrimination and harassment, especially since September 11th. And this is an area, I think, of good news and bad news. I'll start with the bad news. We asked a series of questions about, quote, and the language is in the report again, anti-Muslim discrimination, harassment, verbal abuse, physical attack against individuals, Muslim-owned businesses and institutions in your community. Here's what we got. 60% of the people reported that anti-Muslim incidents had taken place in their community since September 11th, 60%. That was about 3 times as many as those who could recall incidents before September 11th. So clearly there's been an escalation, as you might expect. About half the people we talked to told us that they personally knew somebody who had been victimized by discrimination and harassment since September 11th. And 1 in 4 respondents told us that they themselves had actually been victims. Now, what's involved? The typical incident seems to be a matter of dirty looks, hostile kind of looks at people on the street, petty harassment, verbal abuse, sometimes with a very menacing edge. All of this is in public places, not very often airports, by the way. What's often involved is pushing or shoving on the street, calling people names, having your kids threatened. One girl was told she was going to be blown up. Having people pull up in front of your house at night, scream obscenities. Things of this sort. The more dramatic kinds of things that you might read about in the newspapers, somebody being murdered, someplace being bombed. These are probably pretty rare, but it's these kinds of things that are really within the experience of most Muslims in this country, or at least in the experience of people they know, which must be, on a very daily basis, which must be very unnerving. I promised some good news, and the good news is that many of the people we talked to told us that non-Muslim religious leaders in their community and other prominent people in the community spoke out against these kinds of abuses, maybe following the example of President Bush. And 70% of the Muslim Americans we talked to told us that people have personally, that is, other Americans have personally expressed their support to them. So, in spite of the bad news here, I think we maybe look back on this period as a kind of turning point in the lives of American Muslims. A time of, yes, clearly a terrible tragedy and some very terrible pressure they feel themselves under, but also a time when other Americans became aware of American Muslims, maybe started learning something about Islam, maybe started expressing support for people who are under attack by a bigoted minority, and in which I think Muslims begin to come to grips with their role as American citizens and feel the support of the majority, which I think is really there for them. Okay, I will leave it at that. Let me ask Leann to offer some comments on the poll. Both Leann and Paul, by the way, not only participated in designing the poll, but they also made some of the calls to Muslims around the country in the course of doing the poll. What's that? Oh, Paul. Okay. Paul Jones will go first.
All right.
I am informed.
Okay. I would like to discuss 2 main points that I found when speaking to these Muslims on the phone. The first was that there was a great deal of apprehension on the part of the respondents in their willingness to participate in the survey. They'd often ask me why I was calling them, how I got their phone number, and if a federal law enforcement agent would be knocking on their door and trying to arrest them if they give an answer to a question that differed too far from American popular opinion. I often had to reassure these respondents repeatedly throughout the survey, especially in the beginning, that their answers were completely confidential and that we were trying to help them by educating the general American population about their experiences and their opinions. Furthermore, I found that women were sometimes even more cautious than men in their choice to participate in the survey. A few women that I talked to said that I should call back when their husbands returned home from work. Others wondered why I would even, think to ask their opinion on these issues, because, as some put it, quote, why would they know anything? The women that did participate in the poll were often younger. Older women were, again, more hesitant to participate. Some of the women that we did talk to, though, both younger and older, were very active in the Muslim community and were very happy to be part of a national survey concerning their religion. I would like to move on now to my second point. And towards the end of the poll, Muslims were asked if they'd like to add anything else to their answers. It's kind of an open-ended question. I found that close behind the problems with the Bush administration's handling of the situation in the Middle East was their discomfort with the U.S. media. Sometimes respondents would give us examples of this negative portrayal of Arabs and Muslims in the media. One medium they talked to me about was the motion picture industry. Hollywood, in motion pictures ranging from, say, Aladdin to The Mummy, have used the stereotypical Muslim, an Arab, as the bad guy in the movie. Also, one man told me that he thought it was ridiculous that the national media would provide so much coverage of the arrests of hundreds of Muslims in the United States soon after 9/11, when the majority were never convicted or let alone even tried for any crime. He wondered why there wasn't such a large media blitz to report the release from custody of these Muslims. That would, in his words, quote, help to save face for the people of his religion. Another respondent told me, quote, I think Americans are ignorant towards Muslims, mainly because of the ways in which the media portrays Muslims around the world. One respondent said it very simply, quote, the media is largely responsible for the negative attitudes Americans have towards Muslims. Another person expanded on this idea. She believes that the media is being unfair in the way they, quote, side strongly with the Israelis over the Palestinians, and this helps to influence America's bias towards Muslims. And this leads me into what Leann would like to talk about. So, Leann?
Well, as a researcher polling Muslim Americans, two things also stood out to me. One being the instances of abuse and discrimination that Muslim Americans have experienced since September 11th, and the second being their interest in American foreign policy. Muslims who fit the profile of what Americans consider the stereotypical Muslim look, being Arab, most likely to experience anti-Muslim discrimination and abuse. From speaking with Muslim Americans, the other student researchers and I were able to see that the abuse and discrimination Muslims are suffering can be very emotional. I personally spoke with two women who broke down in tears as they explained the abuse they suffered. One Muslim man claims that after living in the U.S. for 25 years, things have changed for the worse for Muslims. Hostilities towards Muslims have increased. For example, many Muslims told us that they feel like people stare at them and give them dirty looks as if they themselves are terrorists. In one instance, one Muslim woman told us that a passerby pushed her son as she and her son exited a bank. When the Muslim mother asked the passerby if she had seen her son, the woman replied, I see animals. In another instance, women have reported that they stopped wearing the hijab since September 11th, and others told us that they have had their hijabs snatched off their heads. One Muslim college student was waiting in line in a grocery store, and another Muslim cut in front of her and turned around and said to her, Osama's clan can wait. Another customer said to her. One Muslim told us she was called Osama, even though she's a woman. A few Muslims told us that Americans insulted them by saying Islam is a pig religion. As one woman parked her car, a cyclist spit into her face as she had the car window rolled down. One Muslim clearly stated that the aftermath of September 11th is a war on innocent civilians. Many Muslims asked us to relay the message that it's against Islam to hurt innocent human beings. They desire that the American population become educated so that Americans can learn that Islam preaches peace and not terrorism. Secondly, Muslim Americans are strongly inspired and engaged by the U.S. foreign policy debate. The following quotes show their interest. One man paraphrasing from the Quran, says, quote, "The U.S. is correct in what it is doing. Islam does not support that type of behavior. When a person kills another, they have killed part of humanity, and that is where I stand," end quote. In contrast, another respondent felt that international policy of the U.S. is unfair and unjust. These are very typical of responses we receive from Muslims regarding foreign policy. It's important to stress that many Muslims interrupted a question that we asked them and began giving their in-depth description of their educated opinion of a specific part of foreign policy. Muslims show that they are well educated and more engaged about foreign policy issues than the average American might be. If a Muslim wasn't sure how he or she felt about an issue, it was not because they didn't have an opinion. It was often because they had so much knowledge that they had an internal struggle about what answer to give us. I know.
I'm here to give a kind of personal experience of being a young Muslim American. And I think, like every American, your experience has divided between before September 11th and after September 11th. And on September 11th, I was on my way to my criminal law class, and I was walking past the student lounge, and I saw on CNN that the World Trade Tower was on fire, and that a plane had hit it, and I thought, somebody is in so much trouble because an air traffic controller clearly like messed something up, and like somebody's being sued. And I went to class, and I came back out, and the second tower had been hit, and I think the first tower was on its way down. And I remember then it struck you all of a sudden that this was not an accident, that something very serious had happened. And I immediately thought of my two best friends. One was in Tribeca, and the other went to school in Tribeca. So I was immediately really concerned about that, and also my brother, who I think was supposed to be in court down there. So I was really concerned about my family. And I went to go phone them, and I also, at that moment, sort of began to realize that I hope this isn't a terrorist attack. I really hope that this, like, we aren't responsible for this. And it kind of struck me a little bit. And then I went home, and the next day I was driving to law school, and I turned to my right, and this man was glaring at me with such hostility that I was so sure that I had cut him off, that I had done something. And I was like, ooh, I wish I had an I'm sorry horn, because, maybe I've done something. And then I turned, and he's still glaring at me. I'm like, and it began to slowly dawn on me that he wasn't staring at me because I'd done something, because I hadn't changed lanes. It was because of the way I looked. And it kind of, all of a sudden, it was how I looked was a liability. And I thought, how striking that was, that how you grow up, are born and raised in New York, you don't think about being anything other than an American. And then that moment, it kind of strikes you that even though you always feel that you're a part of the us, that just based on how you looked, you would be perceived as a them. And it was an awakening, I think, for many Muslim Americans who shared similar incidents, that it was a kind of a moment where you knew you were American. You never doubted your own patriotism, but it came a time where you had to almost to a point where it was like redundant, that you had to like assure everybody else around you of your patriotism, that you stood behind America, that you were horrified by what had happened, that you still believed in your faith, but it was a moment where you took on, I did anyway, that you had a new kind of responsibility and duty to take an initiative and educate those around you, instead of leaving it as, well, it's their prejudices and their biases, and it's their responsibility to become educated. And I think that at that moment, the survey very well reflects those kinds of incidents that's happened to Muslim Americans. But I think what's lost in surveys is that feeling, is that incredibly striking sensation of feeling all of a sudden polarized, ostracized in a way, that you have something that you need to constantly support to an exhausting degree. And it's something that I feel, luckily, I think because young Muslim Americans are so well educated, I think that the kind of initiative, I think they're taking on a similar initiative like I am. That when I had done a thesis for my senior year, I'm not clearly September 11th, but on what it was like to be a Southeast Asian Indian, Indian or Pakistani, a Hindu, a Sikh, a Muslim, and how that felt, that kind of tension that I think every immigrant group has of wanting to hold on to your culture and wanting to assimilate, and all of a sudden it became a different kind of sensation of being an American. It was like, you wanted to assert that being a Muslim and being an American wasn't mutually exclusive, that they were complementary, and that's something that I think became really important to young Muslim Americans. That's it.
Thanks, Leann. We will take questions now. I just wanted to point out somebody who just arrived. Zaid Bukhari, who is mentioned at the end of the report, as one of the people who helped us put this together, and particularly reviewed our questionnaire, gave us some suggestions. He himself is the author of one of the larger surveys of Muslim Americans, very knowledgeable in this area, and may be willing to answer some questions after we're done. In any event, yes?
Dennis, the survey covers all communities, but was there any sort of comparison? Could you see a difference between respondents, how they felt if they were from a smaller community than a city? Would it have made a difference?
No, it didn't. One of the things that kind of impressed me about our results was usually you do a survey like this, you find some demographic dimension that really makes a difference. Maybe it's gender, maybe it's nationality, maybe it's whether you're a citizen or not, or whether you're from the South, or whether, I really couldn't find anything like that that came out very strongly. There was a diversity of opinions, but it didn't run across any clear fault line of region or even ethnic origin. Those things didn't seem to matter. Yeah.
I missed the very beginning, and maybe you covered this, but
sure.
I wanted to know, based on this population, how large a population does it represent? In other words, how are you tallying up Muslim Americans?
How many Muslim Americans are there?
Yeah.
I don't think anybody knows. Unfortunately, you might try that one on Zaid, but the demography of Muslim Americans is very poorly known. I think one reason for that, and that makes doing a survey like this difficult, one reason for that is there's no religion question in the census. So we can tell you how many people there are from immigrants from Arab countries or immigrants from Pakistan, but beyond that, estimating the number of Muslim Americans is extremely, extremely hard.
How do you arrive at a representative sample if you don't know the universe that you're sampling?
You don't have to know the size of the universe. All you have to have is a random sampling method, which we did have, and that's described in the report. Yeah?
So the study found that only 1/3 believe that bin Laden was responsible. So the other category, do they believe another group totally non-Muslim?
Well, basically,
who do they think is responsible?
Who do they think is the other? I think there's probably a diversity of who they think the other was. But we did, in a pilot study, which was fairly small, we actually asked about that, and we didn't get, and no one particular response stood out in that. So the other could just, the other is unspecified basically in this final survey.
I mean, do they have to believe that Muslims are responsible because...
They don't have to.
Well, the hijackers were 100% Muslim.
Well, as I indicated, most people in essence dodged the question. I mean, 44% of the people said, I don't know.
We know who the hijackers were. So I guess I'm just trying to understand who they think is responsible. If we know who they are.
It could be some unspecified group.
Somebody else shed some light on it? I mean, the people you talk to?
I know I had 2 respondents. I mean, this is in no way representative, but some people were extremely adamant that people of Jewish descent masterminded the plot. I had one man tell me that he heard that 4,000 people of Jewish descent left New York on the day of the bombings, and that was proof that someone of Jewish descent masterminded the plot. Now, this is no way representative of the rest of the Muslims that believe some other group did it, but not everybody thinks that the Muslims are responsible. So they were either, so some, was it 20% around there answered Al Qaeda, and everyone else.
A third said Al Qaeda.
A third said Al Qaeda. So they don't all feel that Muslims are responsible.
And just to maybe help your question a little bit, there's no doubt that the Muslims, they were Muslim on the plane that were responsible for the hijacking, but it was who was behind it. The Al Qaeda network, led by bin Laden, that is who they're unsure about. There's no doubt that these people are Muslims who hijacked the plane, but they're unclear about who got them to hijack the plane and started the ball in motion.
Actually, I'm gonna disagree a little bit here. The way we ask this question, we don't know what other means. Other may mean other I don't know who. Other may mean anything. There is nothing in this survey to really tell us who the people that said other thought. However, what I'd stress is only 20% chose that alternative. 20% said some other. The biggest groups either wouldn't answer or couldn't answer, and 1/3 said Al Qaeda. The notion that Jews were somehow responsible has been, I think, prominent in Middle Eastern media. The one guy that mentioned this then kind of backed off from it. So I don't think that idea is widespread in this country among American Muslims. Yes.
Was there any correlation between what they said about? I know they made comments about Bush's policy in the Middle East as related to the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. Was there any comment about efforts by the Bush administration at Muslim outreach, or how the administration has handled this situation?
Not specifically. I mean, I do think that they recognize that a lot of leaders were speaking out in defense of the Muslim community, and I think they appreciated that. I think that's important to them. Nobody specifically mentioned Bush in this context. We did this poll at a time when the Israelis were invading Palestinian territories, and there were some, I think, very troubling images of what was going on, troubling certainly for Muslims, watching that invasion, and in which President Bush was sort of every day on one side or the other of the issue. And I think that was probably what was most in their mind about him. Some people in the survey did express some hope that he might be able to mediate a fair resolution, but most didn't trust him to do that. Yeah.
I wanted to get into the political question. Sure. You mentioned earlier that a lot of them identify themselves as Democrats.
Right.
And did you get it all? I've heard statistics that in the 2000 election, a lot of Muslim Americans and Arab Americans actually voted for Bush. And did you get into that question at all?
We didn't ask them who they voted for. However, I've seen, I think, at least 3 surveys in which the majority, or at least not the majority, but the larger group, and you can look in the back of the report, it's the number who say they're Democrats quite a bit larger than the number that say they're Republicans. I don't know about the Bush elections. Do you know anything about that?
They are, like in our survey also, 40% Democrats, 28 independent, 23 Republican. But when we asked about voting exactly, the gentleman was asking, I think the majority of the South Asian and Arabs, they voted for Bush, and even 20% of Afro-Americans, they also voted for Bush.
So the majority of
South Asian and Arab
did vote for Bush. Yeah. Suggesting
and South Asian Americans voted for Bush.
Well, they seem to have lost their faith in him, if you judge from the responses to our question about that. But that really is a deviation from what I think is pretty consistent in the polls I've seen anyhow. Not that there are very few polls out there, but the ones that are seem to indicate more Democrats than Republicans.
ID definitely there are more Democrats.
Yeah. Okay. Other questions for myself or the students? Yeah.
Just I'm curious to how recent some of these incidents have taken place? I mean, you talked about immediately after September 11th, but are you seeing a decline? I mean, we're in almost June.
We only asked about before and after.
Like how soon after?
Well, we're doing it in April, and the questions were, since September 11th, have you experienced any of this? And before September 11th, have you? So the world divides on this day. And so it is hard to have a sense of whether there may have been a decline since September 11th. Yes?
I'm curious about some of your methodology.
Yeah, sure.
Where am I looking here? I think it's page 4. Indicates
Indicates how we sampled?
how
or?
you. I'm curious. I'm looking for the precise.
Yeah, I can explain.
But
yeah.
it seems to me that the sample size, 500 for a national poll is in my experience a little bit on the small side. Over 2 weeks, there's a 10-point swing. But I'm particularly curious in that in the potential. Here we go. 500 Muslims, most of the U.S. citizens, were contacted by telephone in late April. And somewhere elsewhere you refer to that there was a computer program to find Muslim names. Do you have any concerns that builds in an inherent bias in the sample size?
Well,
that there are a number of Muslims who may not have been contacted because they don't have
absolutely
names?
We say that in the report. Let me address both questions. Number one, sample size. We contacted 521 people for this poll and about 30 people for a pilot poll. The statistics of this are pretty well established. That is, that gives you a margin of sampling error of about 5%. So any result that hinges on a 5% difference is not believable. The main problem with having this small sample is not that the results are not believable, but when you start breaking it down and looking at more refined groups, I mean, I'd like to be able to look at young Muslims who live in big cities. Well, you just can't do that with this size sample. But for the general big results of the survey, this is perfectly adequate, and a lot of surveys are of this size. One reason that it's small is it is very hard to reach Muslim Americans, and that's the reason there are so few samples. We don't know much about the demography. We don't have good lists that would enable us to randomly sample in the ideal way to reach what is a very small group. So we used a method. We worked with Zogby International, which is a big national polling firm that's done a lot of these surveys. In fact, it may be that they've done all the surveys of Muslim Americans. I know they worked with Zaid, and the other surveys I know of, they did. Am I correct about it? Can you think of any that any other firm has done? I mean, they've been the real ones that have really specialized in this. And basically, they use a software that searches out for different known Muslim ethnic groups, typically Muslim names. The problem with that is a small one. It includes some people who in fact aren't Muslims, but that's of no sampling significance whatsoever. The problem is we screen that out. We ask, the first question is, are you a Muslim? And that's inconvenient for the caller, but has no sampling significance. The sample problem is that there are clearly people who don't have typically Muslim names. We don't know exactly who they are or whether there is any bias in that. That is there some particular group that gets excluded? We would guess that converts might be excluded if they don't change their names. So that means that basically typically white American native-born converts might be excluded. And it may be that many African-American Muslims would be excluded by that if they don't have typically Muslim names. But we really don't even know that. All we can say is we're missing the people who don't have the typical names. What I would say beyond that gives me faith in this is that there is a very small indication of really systematic differences in this sample. That is, when we compare the people from Arabic speaking backgrounds to other people in the group, we didn't see any big difference. When we compared the native born to the non-native born, no big difference. And so that seems to indicate that some kind of the danger of systematic exclusion of some subgroup may not be so great if this is a group that feels fairly consistently about these kinds of issues, or at least doesn't divide along any obvious demographic lines. So, like every poll, there are limits to precision, which in this case is plus or minus 5%. There are problems of sampling. In any study of Muslim Americans, the sampling problem is particularly difficult. Other questions? Yes.
How many of the white native-born Americans with Muslim names were there? You mentioned the number.
Well, they'd have to all have a Muslim name to get in the survey. 6% of the people we talked to were native-born and white.
Questions 6, 7, and 8 deal with discrimination, harassment, and attacks against Muslims. And I recognize that question 8 seeks to ascertain personal knowledge. Did the callers make an effort to specify personal knowledge, as in this person whom I know experienced versus I read in the newspaper or saw on television, and so that is encompassed inside personal knowledge? Well, there's two ways that people get the signal, and we can ask the two callers here what their experience with that was. But there are two ways in which the questionnaire is designed to clearly signal that. First, we asked about incidents in your community. So the next question is clearly not that. We're signaling something else. The other thing is that the question 8 is the way the question 8 is phrased. Do you personally know of any Muslim? So I'm assuming that this is really directed at somebody that they personally know, and it is a smaller percentage. I don't know, Leann or Paul, did you have any thought about that? Did they also, in many of these cases, they did talk about some personal incident. Is that right? Yeah. Yes.
I hate to go back to the university.
Feel free.
Again, but
we don't charge.
When you say Muslim names,
yes.
What if it's like Yahya Sadowski or Yusuf Brown? Would that trigger entry into your?
Yeah, but my sense is yes. I mean, the first name, last name, anything that triggers it. I mean, the program is probably too generous because we ended up calling a lot of people who say they're not Muslims. So, we try to make it as expansive as possible. One obvious problem is you've got Christians from the Middle East who may have typically Muslim names.
It's not necessarily both names. It's either one would
have to be both names. I think this is not really a huge problem, though it may sound like it is. That is, it's only a problem if the people that don't have these names, the Muslims who don't have these names, fit two things. Number one, they are large in number. There are a lot of Muslims out there that don't have Muslim names. Number two, they are really different in the way they feel. And I'm dubious that both things are true, but I can't prove it.
But I mean, from a journalistic point of view, obviously we want to say what percentage of the what percentage of the entire U.S. population is represented by these views. I mean, that would be a natural thing to
So what
include
you're
in a
saying,
story.
what percentage of people are Muslim Americans, essentially?
Or no, those sampled
Or what
by
percentage of
poll.
Muslim Americans did we get? I'm not sure what your question is.
No, how much, well, in a sense, both, but how, yeah, for purposes of this poll, you obviously don't cover all Muslim Americans because converts may in many cases not.
Yeah, although we did have 6%, surprised me, 6% white native born, which suggests converts.
Okay. That's all right. I know, I think I understand the limits of what I'm asking.
To follow
Sure.
on sort of and I'm sorry to harp on this, but I just find it interesting because I've never heard of a sample crafted in precisely this manner.
I think every survey that I'm aware of of Muslim Americans has been done this way, actually. Unless the only alternative is to say, all right, we're going to get all the members of a particular organization. But if you get the people who've joined a particular organization, they're going to have a particular prejudice, which is not what you want.
My question about identities and attitudes within specific communities. And I'm assuming you just got the list from the phone company, and it went through the computer, so that, Yusef Smith or Ali Smith, who doesn't necessarily want to be identified in the phone book as a Muslim, who had his listing as A Smith or Y Smith, or was unlisted, is also dropped out of the potential universe.
Sure.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much. Hi. Yes. Oh, I'm glad you came. Yes, take 2 copies. Take a couple of copies.
Book TV's In Depth with